Welcome in, welcome in. So glad you all are here with us. We're going to allow a couple more moments for folks to roll in and then we'll get started. Thank you for being here. If your Zoom name is listed as your organization, feel free to change that if you can. We'd love to know who's in the room. All right. Let's get started. Welcome everyone. This webinar is a collaboration between Healing Equity United and the War Cry podcast. We're here to talk about the important topic of missing murdered Indigenous women and people. So to start us off, as many of you know who have been to our webinars, we like to start off by acknowledging the land that we are on. And so we are acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today, despite the fact that we are meeting on a virtual platform. The Healing Equity United team is on the lands of the Muwakma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territory lands. We'd like to take a moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since even before the US was formed as a nation. While the numbers vary, in 1492, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already living here. Today, there are 6.8 million Indigenous peoples in the US and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systemic destruction of their communities and culture. This continues through present day. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you to look up the land that you are on. My colleague Jess will be dropping a link in the chat so that you can check that out. Educate yourself about the communities that are native to your land and share your learning with others. And take action to support local Indigenous communities when you can. Thank you. Fiona?
Thank you, Cassie. Look, we are so excited to be in community with our siblings here that I am going to share a significantly shortened diversity statement. We want to make sure that you all know that you are welcome in this space, but we want to create as much time for them to share. And so from Healing Equity United to all of you, we welcome into this space people of all genders. This might include those who identify as women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. We welcome into the space people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islanders, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, people who have multiple descents are welcome. We welcome all of the languages that might be spoken here, some of which might include Spanish, English, Indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people who are currently struggling to get access to the resources necessary for survival, like healthcare, adequate housing, reliable transportation, and childcare, and those people who are currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible. We welcome people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, two-spirit, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or for all of those for whom none of those labels might fit. Last, but certainly not least, we welcome survivors. So most authentically, from Healing Equity United to all of you, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Fiona Oliphant, and I am a member of the Healing Equity United team. I have a multitude of identities that are important to me, but again, we want to create as much time as possible for the War Cry podcast team members to share. So I will just say I'm a Jamaican American. Being a co-conspirator with immigrant communities, particularly those who are undocumented, is really important to me. My family has mixed racial identities and mixed ethnic identities, all of which pose significant challenges socially and within the family. And finally, I'll say that it's really important for me to recognize the identities that I hold, which are most often associated with power and privilege, as well as those that are associated with oppression. And when I'm in a space to leverage my power and privilege, that I do so with as much frequency and efficacy as possible. Kathy?
Thank you, Fiona. I'll also do a quick intro so that we can get moving along to our guest speakers. My name is Patsy Whitefoot. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Consultant for Healing Equity United. I identify as mixed race or biracial. I also identify as Chinese American. I identify as an educator. I used to be a middle school science teacher, and so education is at the heart of everything that I do. And Fiona, back to you.
Briefly going to share what Healing Equity United is. It is a collaboration that came together to support individuals and organizations to identify how oppression impacts their work, their interconnectedness. We do so with trainings. We are committed to having a free space every month to promote accessibility. But we also support organizations with assessments to determine where they might be on their equity journey. And we also provide technical assistance to shift from simple awareness to action and shifting cultures. Wanted to also share that Healing Equity United has a podcast as well, and we are excited about exploring the possibility of having a collaboration, the War Cry podcast, and seeing what we might do with that. I believe Cassie's going to put that into the chat. There you go. And yeah, now we go, Cassie.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for making sure to get that in there. So for our time today, you might have seen these goals within the Eventbrite. I will briefly read them aloud for accessibility purposes. So we're here to learn more about this crisis of missing, murdered Indigenous women and people, and to address the disproportionate coverage of Indigenous people who are missing. We're here to engage in culturally responsive education. We might hear our guest speakers speak to the truth behind imposing institutions, including but not limited to the boarding school era, Indian Child Welfare Act, etc. And we're also going to hope to leave you with some resources to be able to take action and to educate others within your network as well. Fiona?
So if you've attended any of our webinars in the past, you know that Healing Equity United is really about co-conspiracy, right? Like moving beyond allyship when we can, when it's safe to do so. And we want to be co-conspirators in this space and create as much opportunity to lift up others doing this work that's so crucial. And so in that vein, we want to hand over the reins for the remainder of our time together. And we are going to sit back. Feel free to pop some questions into the chat. Kathy and Jess and I will field. And yeah, let's turn it over.
Nifmaitski Minaima Waneksheshki Aitini. Good morning, everybody. My name is Robyn Pebeahsy. I am the a host and producer editor of the Work Cry podcast. I just want to thank Healing Equity United for inviting us here to speak. This is a great opportunity to share our message, which is essentially what we want to do and why this podcast was started. And with that, I'm just want to let you know they'll probably be off screen a lot of the times. I have my daughter here and she likes to jump in, and so if she doesn't see us on, then she won't try to jump in and press buttons and stuff. So let me get started. I'll start sharing our screen. What? Okay, here we go. Let me start sharing here. All right, so we do have the word. This is our symbol or emblem, the War Cry podcast. And this is who we are. So you have me, which is Robyn Pebeahsy. I'm a she, her, editor, co-host, producer. I'm an enrolled member of the Yakama Nation. I am also part Comanche. We have one host who is not able to attend. She had given her blessing. She says, please go on and do the presentation. And this is Emily Washings. And she's our main host. She kind of runs the show. We depend a lot on her. But I don't know if Lucy and Patricia, you want to introduce yourselves?
Lucy, go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Lucy Smartlowit. I am also a Yakama enrolled member. I am part Mexican. I am a co-host of the War Cry podcast when it first started a couple of years ago. And then I also am a part of the community outreach piece. And so in the beginning, doing a lot of work with the families and just speaking with the community overall. I have a master's in social work from Washington University in St. Louis, with a specialization in social economic development. And I also have a master's in criminal justice from Boston University Metropolitan. And then just to give some some hindsight or whatever you want to call it, Robyn and I have both done work with the University of Washington. It was community-based participatory research. And so it was done within our own community. So I just want to preface some of the conversation with that. Thank you, Patsy.
Shikmaitski English when it's just question wiki Patricia Whitefoot. Good morning. I greet you in our language of the Yakama Nation. We're located here in South Central Washington State. I'm a citizen of the Yakama Nation, and today I'm pleased to be a co-host, and I too want to just acknowledge the work that the Healing Equity United is sharing with us today. I hadn't heard about it, but thankful for the work that they're doing. Today I'm a grandmother, great-grandmother, a mother, auntie, you name it, I'm it. But I just wanted to also say I'm a family member of a sister who has been missing, a citizen of the Yakama Nation, but she's a citizen, or she's a descendant of the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon. I also have several sisters. In addition to that, I have several of my family members, immediate family members, who've been murdered on the Yakama Reservation area. And if you take a look at the information on the Yakama Herald Republic newspaper, you'll begin to see some of the individuals who've been murdered and are missing from our communities. And so I look forward to this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you both. Oops. There we go. So who are we? So War Cry podcast. So we are an all Native female run podcast. We do talk about primarily missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. So that includes LGBTQ and Two-Spirit community members. We do focus specifically on the Pacific Northwest, but we also don't want to limit ourselves either, because this issue goes into so many facets of Native American life and community. And so we want to be able to talk about anything. And also, if you just think about the title War Cry, it doesn't have to be just about pain. It could be about victory as well. So that was one thing that really intrigued us about the name War Cry. It's like a double meaning. Also, you can interpret it in many ways. Our logo was created by John Olney Schellenberger. He does Native Anthro. And so that's a website where you can buy a lot of our merch. We have one t-shirt on there. So we're really thankful for him for hosting that for us, as well as designing our logo. And our theme music is by Lee Sikikoptiwa. He is Yakama Hopi Navajo, and his is the Art of a Non-Genius. And so if you listen to our podcast, we have a really nice several versions of our theme music. So please do listen to that when you can and support both of these artists. So again, we want to give a trauma trigger warning. Some of the topics we will be discussing are sensitive, and please take any breaks that you need during the discussion of these topics. But we also kind of want to say, if this is the first time you're hearing it and it feels uneasy, to maybe lean into the uneasiness a little bit, because it's not something easy to digest. It is something that is what some people live with every day. And to have that little bit of discomfort is to have empathy and compassion. And so please, again, but if you need the breaks, please do take them, but also try to absorb a bit of what's going on, because it is not an easy history to learn about. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So we're just going to go through this quick timeline and of federal policy. And a lot of times policy and law kind of really give us a good scope of what the development of the United States and their goals were. So we have 1778, which is the first treaty established. Then we have the BIA was established in 1824. And a lot of people don't know that the BIA was first created under the Department of War. So we have a Department of War, which, you know, obviously has like armies and navies and probably even helping establish militia at that time, those types of things. But they're also the ones who deal with the Native American people at that time. And so it was definitely that kind of sets you up for what we would call the Indian problem, which is it's always going to be a war. You know, there's always some kind of struggle between the relationship of the United States and that of its First Peoples. So the 1830s is the U.S. Supreme Court affirms tribal sovereignty. 1830 is the Indian Removal Act, so which is kind of funny. So we have the Indian Removal Act. It's exactly what it sounds like. So this is the time you're going to see people who are doing like the Trail of Tears. There are several versions. There are like so many versions of the Trail of Tears. I know that there's some notable ones, but I want you to know that there are so many versions of the Trail of Tears, which is essentially you're taking a group of people and you're moving them from one land to another land, which is not their homeland. And the reason you're moving them is because you want access to the land that they're actually on. And the reason you want access to it is because there's resources, there's space, or there's some kind of extraction that you're wanting to use, or because of its location, because it's on a road that is going to be built, or railroad, and you want to be able to have like a railroad town or some kind of mining town or something for future endeavors that will help you give access to other resources you're planning to use. Shortly after that, we have also the Indian Removal Act is when they started putting different tribes on reservations, a lot of the times clumped together. And so they had different rules for different tribes. And I want you all to know that each tribe is dealt with differently. And each tribe has a different treaty that they've signed, different rules and agreements. So in 1855, we have the Yakama Nation Treaty signed, and that's here in Washington State, and that's we're all enrolled Yakama. And so that's just giving us a context of what it is our tribe here in Washington State would look like. 1855 Major Crimes Act, 1871 end of treaty making era, which means that the United States is no longer interested in signing treaties. Like, we're done. We've dealt with all the tribes we want to deal with. You're going to find that there are different kinds of tribes, not just because they're diverse, but we have treaty tribes for those who did sign treaties within that treaty making era. Then you have those who are non-treaty tribes. They can either be recognized by the state or they're recognized by the county. There are some county recognized tribes, or they're a tribe that later got federal recognition after the treaty era, which means that they do not have a standing treaty, whereas if they have some other kind of agreements. And some people will say that a lot of this happened as well for those who wanted to establish themselves for more modern day resources like perhaps casino or tourism, those types of things. And so that there are different federal recognizations of tribes. Let's see, and non-federal recognizations. And then of course we have 1887, which is the Allotment Act. And so that is, of course, where if you were a non-native and you were more than likely an immigrant or someone from the colonies, or it was usually white males. There were some exceptions, but I'd say like 99% were white males. If you had a family, or you could prove you had a family, or that you're going to have a family, you could go to the government of or whatever state or territory you're going to be in, and you can get an allotment, which just means you get X number of acres to develop it. You're basically saying, yes, I'll develop this land for you, United States, and become like a great citizen and contribute to the, the goal of the United States, whatever that is. During this time, we also have the boarding school policy. So I also want to let you know that the majority of these federal Indian policies has to do with either what they would call the civilization of the Indian. There's the saying, save the Indian, save the man and kill the Indian, which is a big thing in boarding school policy in the boarding school era, which is they would, most of the time, they would forcibly remove Native children from their parents and put them in some kind of institution, a school institution that can either be run by the government, run by a lot of the times is religious sectors. It wasn't just limited to Catholics. Some of them were Protestants, Mormons. So a lot of these religious institutions took on saying that they will civilize Indian children, teach them to essentially not be connected to their communities, so that in thinking that they would become assimilated. And then when you also want to assimilate people, you're hoping that they would also maybe not marry other Native people. A lot of these things, so you have to the left, which is concepts of blood quantum began to develop. So of course, that's where you keep track of essentially a pedigree of how much Native blood is in a person. Because if you can keep track of how much blood is within the tribe, you can see the decline, because people are going to start assimilating, they start marrying out of the tribe. They can even marry other tribes and still essentially lower their blood quantum, because it's within that tribe. So if you can at some point prove that there are no more Indians and there's no one else there to contest with, and there's no one to contest with, that means that the lands and their holdings are open, for you to use or extract or put back into public lands for the United States government. So after the boarding school, which of course was something that contributed to this idea of assimilation, it was not only traumatic, extremely traumatic. I can't remember when the last boarding school was still operating. I want to say it's fairly recent, like within the last 3-4 decades, like in the 90s or 80s, I can't remember what it is. There is no family, I want to say, of Native people in the United States and Canada that have not been affected by the boarding school era. And then we have 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. So we're just now citizens in 1924, just so you know. You know, we're able to vote, essentially what it is, even though Native Americans had been participating in wars at that point on their own. And they have Johnson O'Malley, which had to do with Native American education and making sure that there's equal access to education. The Indian Reorganization Act. Let's see, I'm going to go a little quickly. I don't want to take too much more time. We're kind of spending a lot of time on this. These, of course, because they're on recordings, you're more than welcome to take a look at this. I'll just name a couple more of these. So 1956 Relocation Act is where they would take people off the reservations, not necessarily forcibly, but under kind of false promises that they would have opportunities outside of the reservation in large metropolitan areas. But a lot of the times it would be very far away. So like people from Washington would like maybe go to LA or go to New York or somewhere. They would essentially give them a ticket and maybe a voucher or something for a little food, if that, but with promise of work, because obviously being put on reservations with bad resources gives a lot of limit to what kind of work you can find. And so that was the promise of that relocation, which is, hey, go to these cities and, you know, find some work there because there's a lot of work in these cities. And a lot of the times that too had a malicious intent, which is to separate people and separate families because, you know, people need to make money. What happened was we had a development of urban Indian communities, which is a lot of different Native people coming together, and that's something that Native people are resilient in, and it's like they like to come together and like to celebrate things. So there's a lot of cultures that came out of the Relocation Act, which is a lot of urban Indian centers and things like that. The big ones that we that you probably want to look at is the Indian Child Welfare Act and Religious Freedom Act, but the Welfare Act is something that obviously has come up now. And when the boarding school era was finished, it was about taking children directly from their homes and adopting them to other non-Native homes, in the respect that they said, well, Native parents cannot take care of their children, is essentially what it was about. And so if you can see why ICWA had to come about, when you had a lot of children in large numbers, essentially resourced out of their families and tribes and lands, there was a huge disconnection, and you had a lot of people coming up with ways to cope, ways to try to reconnect if they could reconnect. And so please look up ICWA when you can, because that was just recently in the Supreme Court and they had some different hearings on it. So support anything that has to do with reforming ICWA, despite whether or not whatever ruling had come from that hearing, because it's something that's extremely important. And then a lot of the reason it's there is because there's obviously a disproportionate history of Native kids being taken from their homes. Okay, we got Lucy.
Thanks, Robyn. So here is an overview of ongoing issues that continually impact us. And again, this is not something that happens, you know, to each individual. These are, some of them are lived experiences, some of them are overall experiences. So just to give you context of what historical trauma is, there's a great research article published by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart that came out in the 90s, who speaks to historical trauma. But then when we get into it, there's also this historical trauma response, which is something that we could see like with Jewish Holocaust survivors. Then when we think about like the overall issues of the United States and the timeline that Robyn just went over, it has contributed a lot to like microaggressions, micro invalidations that happen within, you know, the mainstream community, which also leads to this ongoing issue of internalized oppression. And that can show in a lot of different ways. You know, it could be through substance use, it could be you know, actually supporting Indigenous mascots, you know, our caricatures of us and so forth. So I'm not going to go into this too much. We'll just go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So as you see here, this is just an example of historical and current factors, again, that impact our wellness and community. So when you think about these and as an overall, for the overall well-being of us as Indigenous people, and then you start throwing in issues like blood quantum and capitalism and reservation life and whatnot, and also the struggle of losing our language and just knowing that our ceremonies were recently able to be practiced 44 years ago. There's still a lot of healing that we have to do within our communities as people. And this is all relevant because it does tie into this historical perpetuation of how Indigenous people have been treated, since Columbus arrived. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Getting down to the meat of some of the state statistics, as Robyn had mentioned, we are focused on the Pacific Northwest. This doesn't exclude, again, what's happening in Mexico. And this also does not exclude, what's happening in Canada either. So I wanted to be able to honor those spaces and know that everybody is fighting their own fight, for their women and children and their missing loved ones. So just to give you an idea really quickly, what's happening in Washington State, we have 128 actively missing, unknown amount of murdered, and that is from our Washington State Patrol report, which has gotten better. They publish like every 2 weeks, and you can find that online as far as like who is missing. In Idaho State, from a report that they released in 2021, we see that there's 12 missing and 2+ murdered. So with this one, I just wanted to be able to say that in Idaho, they're still in the process of working on creating task force, from my understanding, and I could be wrong. They could already be in the process of doing it or established, but I was not able to track down up-to-date data on this. So this is secondary data. And then in Oregon State, I was researching that yesterday and this morning, and I found that it was really interesting too, because Oregon State they just finished establishing a task force with the United States Attorney General's office. And so according to their task force data, they have 11 missing and 8 murdered. But if you were to go to like NamUs or their Oregon State Patrol websites, there would be various numbers. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is also just a breakdown of what has been reported. This is from the report done by the Urban Indian Health Institute with Abigail Echohawk and Anita Lucchesi. This is one of the first reports that really highlighted what was happening with missing and murdered women and girls cases. And so just going back to the reporting systems and whatnot, there's definitely a huge gap of how reporting is done within our communities, amongst the state jurisdiction and amongst the tribal jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction. When we look back at the timeline again, because this is all relevant, it gets complex and messy really quick, to the point where a lot of it is just left, with people's hands up, like, what do we do? So I just want to note that there are active efforts in collecting data that is more accurate and up to date. It is going to take some time, because there is a lot of changes within that system that have to be done as an overall thing. So that includes the relationships between tribes and then federal agencies and states and so forth. So we're also having to kind of cut out the historical pieces of 500 years of some oppression and figure out how we can work together to protect our people. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So the overall statistics, because this is recorded, I'm not going to go over each one, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. And also just want to put out some reminders for people. So more common ones is that Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times higher than all other ethnicities, and that murder is the third leading cause of death for us. And also important to note that more than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women have experienced violence within our communities. And so these numbers can be really skewed depending on where you're receiving the data from. This is an overview of what's happening within the United States, and this is given that people are self-reporting. This doesn't include the people who have not reported or who have reported and then the case was dropped and so forth. And so it really comes down to like a systems issue. And then again, working through the other types of oppression that we work with. So if there's something more specific that you guys are interested in, I would urge you guys to really research the area and the location. The data is slow in getting out there, but it is getting out there. And I'll also include some different resources that you guys could refer to as well. And then with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Robyn.
So with the statistics, I don't know if you all were able to notice, it was a little alarming. The two main places that seem to be a lot of MMIW, MMIP was two of the main cities was Seattle and Tacoma, which is here in Washington State. And on this map, you can actually see the relation of where Tacoma and Seattle is if you aren't from the area. But this is the map of our Yakama Nation Reservation, and this is where we're coming from. I'm here kind of like in this area. And so if you have Montana here or you have California here, we have a highway that goes here and it goes all the way up here. I don't know if you can see my mouse movements, but a lot of the times if you want to go to Spokane or anywhere in Idaho or Montana, you have to come here. There's no freeway going up here. So you have to dip. And you usually go through here, through Yakama. So we are in this really central part of Washington State. So a lot of the times I feel like contributing factors is just the access to the reservation. We are not a closed reservation. We have a very high multicultural aspect to our reservation. And so we have a lot of in and out of coming in. So people going from California and they want to go to Seattle. If they're somewhere in the East region, they're going to go here and come up, or Oregon. But anyway, so this is our reservation and this is what we call our ceded lands. And what that means is these are the lands that we essentially, if you want to put it in more colonial terms, what we gave up. But really what it is we gave the United States access to these lands and rights over these lands. But these are our lands here. We have a lot of closed areas. This is 1.223 million acre reservation, the biggest in Washington State. Colville's a slightly maybe same size, maybe something like that. But anyway, this is essentially what we said is our usual areas that we went around in. So we also still have treaty rights to fish and hunt in these areas. But we will primarily do a lot of our gathering and everything on the Yakama Reservation in our closed areas. So when we're talking about Washington State, this is broken down by county, and you know, we have Yakama County here having one of the biggest cuts of the pie. And second, of course, is King County. So King County, of course, encompasses the city of Seattle, several tribes like the I want to say the Muckleshoot is perhaps one of them. Snoqualmie tribe. Other tribes are located within this slice here, but this is all Yakama Nation tribe here. And this is not a contest that we want to win. This is not a big slice that we want to have a part in. You know, we want to be able to not have this pie at all. But this is what our numbers look like for our region. So we do have a high number of MMIW, MMIP throughout the state. Oh, and Lucy, if you could talk about the vanished.
Look at that.
So right now we have a great reporter that works with us from the Yakama Herald Republic. This will be something that we include in our resources as well. So she is a part of the Vanished, which is the project of the Yakama Herald. So this count is probably outdated, but at that time we had at least 6 people missing and then at least 34 plus murdered. And the reason why it varies is because we learned that from the coroner, it really depends on racial classification when the report was first taken. And so thank you, Cassie, for that. I would encourage you guys to take a look at this when you get the chance. There's some great articles that Tammy has met with families to provide, awareness to their stories. So yes, let's go ahead and move on to the next ones.
Okay, so this is a slide that was put in by our main host. So this is about the Yakama Wars. And essentially what a lot of our podcast does is that we want to not only talk about the more modern day and current situation of MMIW and MMIP, is that we want to, let you all know that this isn't something that's new. So if you would like to take time back, if you look at this recording, you can read the whole thing. But essentially what it means is that the Yakama Wars started with violence against Yakama women. Because the men had come back and seen that a lot of the women were hurt and a lot of the girls, had violence against them. And so it was about them going out to retaliation against those who had hurt their women and their children, which essentially led to the Yakama Wars and essentially led to the signing of the treaty. And so we can always talk about like what that scene looked like. There's a lot of other factors that go into the signing of the treaty, and whether or not people actually wanted to be there is a different question, or if they were forcibly there or being told that you would be killed or we would kill so-and-so if you didn't come in and sign this treaty. But that's for another talk. One of the big things that we have, if you would so kindly and try to listen to our podcast, we have our first episode called Dusky Maidens Are in Demand. And essentially what it is, it's a, I think it was like 1910, December 10th ad, or kind of like it, I don't really know what it's like, a column or something that talks about essentially Native women. And again, if you would look at the recording and visually read the entire article, this was circulated throughout the United States. And essentially what it is it says, well, we have Native American women here. If you were to marry one, you could get access to their lands, you can get all of their tribal benefits, and you essentially don't have to even keep them if you don't want to. You can, move on, and you and your children would still have all of these benefits of marrying a Native woman. And these Native women want that, essentially is kind of what the article is saying. We have a whole episode dedicated to just this article. And again, it came out in the early 1900s, which was only like 50 years or something removed from when this treaty was signed. And so a lot of the times we ask, why does MMIP still persist? And when we're talking particularly about women, Lucy kind of touched on it. It's about, a lot of the times there's misclassification. I see I have a typo in there, but racial misclassification, a lot of times they don't even know these people are Native when they find them. People are scared. So that's something we're not really able to get too in-depth to, but we have possible perpetrators who live on our reservation or off, or who we know essentially have access to our families, or who are local or who are not local. If we look at various serial killer patterns, we have an episode recently about serial killers and what that looks like, at least here on the Yakama Reservation. People are scared of repercussions from perpetrators. So they have a family member and they're scared, well, if I say anything, perhaps something would happen to me next. There are times people have been given those threats, like say anything, you're the next person. Underfunding of tribal police. I want to say also underfunding of an encouragement of Native women on tribal police. I know maybe one or two who are on our current tribal police force, and they bring a different dynamic into the whole tribal police sector, and I think it's very important for them. We also have confusing and layered jurisdictions. So when we go and we talk about the reservation, and again, what I showed you from the ceded lands to the, there's trust lands, reservation lands, federal lands, and we also have all of those layered jurisdictions of city police, state police, tribal police, federal police, the FBI, all those things. So a lot of the times, those are a lot of hurdles, is to figure out which sector does this case go into, depending on if it was a Native perpetrator or a non-Native perpetrator. You know, that's a big person, or if the woman was enrolled or not, or if they were a descendant, you know, those types of things are, if the victim was a descendant or the victim identified, you know, those types of things are hard to navigate. As well as ever constant changing interpretations of federal laws. So we have Oklahoma versus McGirt, as well as ICWA, as we just mentioned, also being in federal courts and trying to reinterpret what treaties mean. And what was that language about? And it really depends on if you have people who advocate and want to see tribes thrive, is kind of what it is, and it comes down to. And then, as mentioned before by our host, which is the lack of media and awareness. And of course, we often get asked to talk about the Petito case. We don't really necessarily make comments on the Petito case, but we do know that the family acknowledged themselves that, you know, there was a disproportionate coverage of their daughter opposed to those who were Indigenous or who were BIPOC. Okay, we got Lucy.
Let's go ahead and jump to Patsy's section. And if y'all want to check out the podcast, we do have some great people that we interviewed in our first and second seasons. So we'll turn it over to Patsy.
Since we have about 2 minutes left, I just want to say that in terms of, you know, the personal issues that I have dealt with over many, many years with my sister and family members who've been murdered, it really takes a toll on families. And this is a very sensitive topic, one that I addressed with my own family. And so as we think about that, I recall one of my sisters who said, you know, in talking about her sister who was murdered in our housing project, you know, a HUD housing project, she speaks that the land cries out as the blood of our people flows on the land. And so that's very true when we think about the number of people that who have been murdered and are missing. And so in speaking to that, we also have to recognize that we have to come together as families, and resiliency is going to be something that's critical for us to work toward. However, at the same time, when there's loss, it's only natural for families to go through grief, pain, sorrow, and hurt, all of those feelings that they go through. And so that's been my role, is just to be there with families, to give phone calls to individuals, and also just, you know, being mindful of the fact that we still are together as a people, despite the fact that cultural genocide is a part of a history, and historical and intergenerational trauma is still with us. And so it's just a common theme that we continue to gravitate toward, is that of you know, resiliency, and also, you know, I feel like liberation, but it doesn't feel like liberation, but some type of resolve about what's been going on and dealing with all of the sectors that are involved with this. Next slide, please. So for me and my family, it's remembering the land and where we come from. We're here in the Pacific Northwest, and I consider the Pacific Northwest my home, because as a child, this is where I was raised, and I was on the Columbia River between the state of Oregon and Washington, fishing there with my family as a child, and we still travel there to go fishing. But it also means preparing the next generation so that they don't have to deal with some of the issues that we as adults and grandparents have dealt with in our life. Although these issues that we're talking about are still a part of our community, we can help to provide safeguards and protection and prevention efforts for our grandchildren and the future of our people. And so in this one, I'm just been working with some girls, you know, teaching them some of our social dances and history, drumming and singing. And that's what it takes for us to be able to continue moving forward. Next slide. So Lucy is the one who got us started talking about our own self-care as well. I'm so thankful for Lucy because she is a counselor. She has this background. And so just reminding us of taking care of ourselves and all of us that are participating in this podcast. It's about resiliency, taking care of self, but also acknowledging these external forces that have been a part of our life over many, many, many years. And the history that Robyn addressed, you know, she just gave you a slight perspective in the 30 minutes that we have with you. There's so much to that history that we need to go into. It's very deep, but we also have to remember that we also are the survivors that are still here, and that we are we are the advocates, we are the mothers, we are the change makers. Next slide. And some of the resources and how you can support families. Again, I'm just going to refer you to the next following slides that will be posted. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our podcast. So thank you very much. We'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing, for being here, for taking time out of your days to uplift this important topic. We have a few questions that have come through the Q&A. I'll read off the first one. I'm joining from Canada. Would boarding schools be similar or the same to the residential school system that they have up in Canada?
It would be the same. Just my own personal experience. I was in a mission school. My grandmother was in a military boarding school, so they would be the same. Similar situations. Policies might have been a little bit different, but the same intent to assimilate the Indians and basically cultural genocide.
Thank you, Patricia. Lucy and Robyn, anything to add?
Just to note that the boarding school era is not that far, so we can talk, my grandparents went to boarding school, and Robyn had mentioned that the boarding schools were they were transitioned to the tribes opportunity to educate in the 1980s. And so I believe one of our last ones did close in 1990s that was ran by the United States. So it's really not that far, fetched as far as like something that happened within the past 50 years.
Thank you, Lucy. All right, next question. Would particular government social procurement help alleviate any of the violence towards Indigenous women?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, the question was, would particular government social procurement help alleviate any of the violence towards Indigenous women?
I don't really understand that question, I'll be honest. Would there be a way to elaborate what that means?
Yeah, if the person who asked that question would maybe add a little more context, you can pop that into the Q&A, that would be helpful. And in the meantime, any other questions that folks are curious about?
I did see the one about the Yakama Herald, so the vanished, which is actually, there's a special, usually when you're reading Yakama Herald stuff, you do kind of need a subscription, but I think they did some kind of special thing where if it's about MMIWP and vanished related, you can read as many as you like. If I believe that. If I think that's what they were saying. Yeah, Lucy's saying, yeah, that was it. And it's about access and wanting to give people access so that they can have awareness, which is actually very progressive, I feel.
Someone asked about showing the slide on ways to donate and help. Oh, that's already down, Robyn, sorry. But people will have access to the information.
Yes, oh, go ahead, Lucy.
I'm just gonna, it looks like our person did not have a chance to elaborate really quickly. So for time's sake, I do want to be able to talk about it in just a moment. So, or for just a moment. So particular government social procurement, I can't necessarily speak to that because there really isn't like a cookie cutter way to alleviate any of the violence towards Indigenous women. So here we go. We are trying to involve more and more Indigenous businesses to the supply chain. Do you think that it may change things? I hope that it changes things in Canada for y'all because it would be a great model for us to be able to adapt and potentially work here. As far as special government procurements, I really think that we need to just start changing the narrative, whatever that is, you know, within our own communities, educating ourselves, educating and teaching our young ones to, you know, defend themselves or to know who's okay to talk to, who isn't, or to bring things up and believe it when it happens. You know, unfortunately, we just got Deb Holland in, and so this discussion is barely being talked about publicly, you know, within the past 10 to 15 years. So hopefully in the next 10 to 15 years, the government can have something that contributes to alleviating the violence. But I do believe it's going to be a slow process. Patsy, Robyn, did you guys want to add anything?
Well, I think because we're coming down to the end, I just wanted to add that this discussion also focuses on the fact that we're a population of people that's basically invisible. It's not in the narrative of mainstream America. And so we do the podcast here in the Northwest, just reaching out to other tribal communities or in Canada, or where Indigenous people are in Mexico as well. So that's, I think, is one of the major issues, is that of invisibility and under-identification of Native people, misrepresentation, and not understanding the impact of historical and cultural genocide. Thank you, Robyn.
I would just reflect essentially what Lucy had said, which is there's never going to be a cookie cutter answer for that. There's so many complexities and so many historical connections to it that there's never going to be one answer that would help alleviate things. But also I feel that a way that could help is to, since there's such a deep-rooted mistrust of government institutions in tribal communities, to give more sovereignty and to give more, how would you say, to empower sovereignty in tribes would be one of the best ways to reinforce that tribes tend to know what's right for their communities is probably the best thing, because anytime that we've seen the government step in to try to solve something just tends to make it worse.
Thank you, Robyn, Lucy, Patricia, for your time, for sharing about this important topic. There was a lot of love in the chat for you all being here and presenting. So hopefully you got to see those comments. I wish we had more time for this, but this is just more of a reason for folks to follow the Woke Isn't Enough and War Cry podcast as we continue to dive into collaborating. I dropped the link for the War Cry podcast there. Please follow. I also want to uplift and name, please, if you have the financial capabilities to donate to the War Cry podcast team, there is a link in there to do that as well. We saw that we didn't get to all of the questions. I know there was one about resources, and in the follow-up email that I'll be sending out, we'll include the recording for this, as well as a resource list so that you can share that with your networks. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here.